I think historically, Nantucket is just a wonderful metaphor for the American experience, that people shoved off from that island and got in their small boats and then in their larger boats and then in their ships and put to sea and went whale hunting clear around the globe into the Pacific.
Gradually, they push it a little farther until they're going out into the Gulf Stream. And then they go up almost to the Arctic Circle, to the west coast of Africa, down around Cape Horn into the Great Pacific. So then by the 1830s and 40s, Nantucket was the whaling center of the world. And it only lasted for a little more than a century, but it's really what has determined so much of what Nantucket is today.
I turned around and saw him about 100 rods directly ahead of us, coming down with twice his ordinary speed of around 24 knots, and it appeared with tenfold fury and vengeance in his aspect. The surf flew in all directions about him with the continual violent thrashing of his tail, his head about halfway out of the water, and in that way he came upon us and again struck the ship. The captain's boat was the first that reached us. He stopped about a boat's length off, but had no power to utter a single syllable. He was so completely overpowered with the spectacle before him. He was in a short time, however, enabled to address the inquiry to me. "My God, Mr. Chase, what is the matter?" I answered, "We have been stove by a whale." So read the recollections of Mr. Owen Chase, as related in his 1821 memoir entitled, in wonderfully early 18th century fashion, Narrative of the Most Extraordinary and Distressing Shipwreck of the Whale Ship Essex, in which he recounts his experience, which took place exactly 205 years ago today, Monday, 20 November 1820, of being aboard a ship that was attacked and destroyed by a very large, very pissed-off sperm whale. If you were made to read Herman Melville's Moby Dick when you were in junior high or high school, which if you're over age 35 you most certainly were, the sinking of the Essex was the incident that provided Melville with the climax of that novel's narrative. It also apparently provided the inspiration for a major motion picture titled In the Heart of the Sea, directed by Ron Howard, starring Chris Hemsworth, which died such a swift death at the box office and received such poor reviews. I never even heard of the damn thing until I was researching this video. Now, even in the best of times, serving aboard a whale ship in the early 1820s was an experience whose difficulties can't be imagined by any of us pampered mollycoddles living over 2 centuries later. But in the worst of times, like when your vessel gets smashed to timbers underneath your feet by a very angry cetacean, and you and your shipmates wind up consigned to the open ocean in small whaleboats at least 1,200 miles from the nearest landfall, well, I'll tell you the story, and you can decide what adjective describes it best. It's Thursday the 20th of November. This is Curmudgeon's Corner. From high atop the battlements of Castle Curmudgeon, where, despite many scurrilous rumors to the contrary, Darcy Blows is not what they used to say when Kamala Harris showed up at a Sacramento Coke party back in the early 90s. Good afternoon, Mr. and Mrs. America and all ships at sea. Welcome to Curmudgeon's Corner. Let's talk about whaling. We are conditioned to believe, here in our oh-so-modern, oh-so-enlightened age, that the whaling industry was a terrible, cruel, monstrous thing, a barbaric vestige of our distant past, a trade that was only plied by evil, dastardly men who hated nature and reveled in the torture and killing of innocent sea creatures. But as with many other things we are conditioned to believe, that's a big load of bullshit. In point of fact, we owe a not inconsiderable debt of gratitude to the men who did that very dangerous, very grueling work, many thousands of whom perished in the act of doing it. For without their exertions, none of the things we like and rely on and take for granted would exist today. Without the advances in illumination and lubrication that were enabled by the large-scale production of whale oil, we never gained the ability to effectively exploit our planet's reserves of its best energy sources, first coal, then crude oil, and later natural gas. If there is no whale oil, there is no industrial revolution. If there is no industrial revolution, there is no modern society. So how about let's try to take a more honest, more nuanced, less morally reductive view of the people and events in our past, lest we make ourselves look like a bunch of damned ignorant fools. The Essex was first launched in 1799, so she's a little more than 20 years old at the time our story takes place. She's built in Amesbury, Massachusetts. Her home port is Nantucket. And no, just because I said Nantucket, that doesn't mean I'm going to invent an off-color limerick for your amusement, no matter how badly you want me to. And besides, I already reached my quota of one Kamala Harris joke per episode. As ocean-going whale ships go, Essex is a little on the small side. She's only 88 foot in length, around 240 tons berthen. But she is considered a lucky ship. She has completed 6 successful voyages in her career to this point, which gives some indication of how long these trips typically last. 2 to 3 years on average. And when you take a look at her crew manifest, it gives an indication of just how hazardous and grueling this occupation was, because this was decidedly a young man's game. The captain, George Pollard, is 29 years old. The rest of the ship's complement, 20 men in total, 2 officers, 3 petty officers, 2 specialists, 13 able seamen, 7 black, 13 white. Of the ages which are known with certainty, all of them are between 14 and 26, and a majority under 20. Which is to say, you might only complete 3 or 4 of these voyages in your career. By that time, it's pretty likely that you have either been killed outright or your body is so completely wrecked you are no longer able to carry out your duties. What did those duties look like? Nothing that you or I would ever want to do, that's for damn sure. The New Bedford Whaling Museum in Massachusetts has a really outstanding explanatory page about it, which I will link in description, but the abbreviated long and short of it is this. First, the lookout sights a whale or a group of whales. If he is a skilled lookout, he can make the sighting up to 8 miles away, and he can tell just by the appearance of the spout whether it's the kind of whale that you want or the kind that's not worth taking. If it's the kind of whale you want, you run out the whale boats. The whale boats are around 30 foot in length. They are commanded by a petty officer called a boat head or a boat steerer, and there's a harpooneer. What a great word that is. We need to bring that word back. And there's 2 or 3 able seamen to man the oars and the ropes. When and if you get close enough to the whale to be within harpooning distance, there are no harpoon guns in these days. You have to get close enough to actually plunge that thing into the creature's back and hope that it holds fast. You stick him with the harpoon, the whale gets very upset and tries to flee, and then it becomes not unlike fishing with really big fish. You want him to swim around and get sufficiently exhausted so that he stops struggling and you can approach him closely enough to stab him in the heart and kill him. You've got a few hundred feet of rope spooled around a device called a loggerhead, which, yes, that's where we get the expression at loggerheads, which means a thing has reached its limit. So you pay it out, and you reel it back in, then you pay it back out, and you reel it back in, and hopefully within an hour or so, he's tired enough that you are able to kill the bastard. Then you have to tow the carcass back to the ship, powered just by men pulling oars, mind you. Then you lash it to the side, and a scaffold is lowered down, and the men begin the work of cutting the blubber away with devices that look not unlike a halberd that you might have seen in a medieval battlefield, with a big cutting blade on the end of a 15-foot wooden pole. First, you cut the blubber into slabs about 4 foot by 6 foot, and if you do the cutting right, it coils up into something that resembles a roll of insulation, except it weighs about a ton. Each one of those gets hoisted up onto the deck, and the other men get to work cutting it into successively smaller sections until the pieces are the correct size that you can toss them into the tripod, which sits on top of a furnace that's mounted on the foredeck. And obviously, given the fact that you're aboard a ship that's being tossed about on the ocean waves, there are ample opportunities for being scalded with hot water or boiling oil or washed over the side. There's really no shortage of ways to die a horrible, agonizing death during the completion of this process. So if you've taken, let's say, a 40-ton sperm whale, you can easily imagine that you're looking at several days at minimum of men slaving away around the clock in 2 shifts before the work is complete and you have skimmed all the oil out of the tripods and into the casks and stowed the casks down in the hold. And then it's time to go get another whale. And you can well imagine the stench that's associated with living aboard one of these vessels, a stench that pretty much remains on your person for the rest of your life. It used to be said you could smell an old whaler coming from a block away, even if he hadn't been to sea in some years. Why were so many men willing to do such an awful, miserable, dangerous job? Because you could make a lot of money if you managed to return home alive. Essex had a pretty uneventful, pretty unsuccessful journey, the first part of it. As it turns out, she departs Nantucket August of 1819, and the original plan was to sail around Cape Horn and do her hunting in the waters off southern Chile. But she didn't have much luck there, so she went northward off the coast of Peru, and her luck started improving rather markedly. By May of 1820, she has managed to fill 450 barrels of oil. She spends much of the next 6 months in Ecuador, getting the ship repaired and refit, and in the Galapagos Islands, taking a bit of shore leave and gathering provisions for the remainder of the trip. It was about 1,000 miles west of the Galapagos, where Captain Pollard had been advised there was good hunting to be had, and that is where the fateful attack took place on the 20th of November. The aggression of the whale remains unexplained. There are competing theories on that, But there is no controversy about the fact that it was just about the biggest goddamn sperm whale anybody ever saw. When it was briefly alongside the ship, its head was at the stem and its tail was at the stern, so a 90-footer, in other words, probably around 80 tons in weight. And when a creature of that size decides to get pissed off at a wooden ship, the ship is going to lose, and Essex lost. Fortunately, though, her wreck remained sufficiently afloat for the next couple of days that the men were able to grab some navigational equipment and some charts and some provisions before they took to the open ocean in the whaleboats, at least 1,200 miles from the nearest dry land. They've basically got three choices. They can sail to the Marquesas Islands, the Society Islands, or the Pitcairn Islands. It's decided they don't want to try the first two options because some of the men have heard legends, which were quite widespread in those days, that those island groups are inhabited by cannibals. And yes, it has to be said, and I know some of you are thinking it, that there's more than a little bit of comic irony in not choosing the best option because you are afraid of cannibals only to be reduced to cannibalizing each other. Because that's what happened in the actual event, but not quite yet. After a month at sea, with all the survivors still alive, the three boats managed to make landfall at Henderson Island in the Pitcairn group. And if they had landed on Pitcairn Island instead, we would probably have a much more interesting story since the bounty mutineers of 30 years ago and their descendants were still living there. But they made Henderson instead, which was uninhabited then and remains uninhabited today, for reasons that quickly became apparent to the Essex survivors. There is a very limited food supply and only one intermittent source of fresh water. So after about a week, it becomes clear they're going to have to take to the boats again. Except three of the men say, nah, we're good. We've had just about enough of that open boat shit. This island can't support 20 of us, but we can probably make a go of it if there is only 3. So if you fellows should happen to reach safety, please do arrange for someone to come pick us up. And here is where things started getting pretty grim in the boats. Since Henderson has such a limited food supply, they weren't able to take all that many provisions with them, and within just a few days, men started dying. For the first couple of deaths, the men were given dignified burial at sea, or at least the nearest thing to one that could be arranged in the circumstances, but after that, hunger supplanted human dignity, and a total of 6 men were eaten after they died. At some point during this period, one of the boats got separated from the other 2 and wasn't seen again until a whaleboat with 4 skeletons aboard was discovered washed ashore on Ducie Island some months later. Oh, but it still gets worse. On the 6th of February, 1822, aboard Captain Pollard's boat, with provisions long since exhausted and the half-dozen men remaining all on the verge of starvation, it was decided to draw lots, and one man would be shot and eaten. The man who drew the short straw, his name was Owen Coffin. So I guess take that for what you will. And then the remaining 2 boats got separated from each other. One of them decides to try for Easter Island. The other one decides to try for Mas Afuera Island off the coast of Chile. Neither one has got a snowball's chance in hell of actually making it, but as luck would have it, on the 18th of February, the boat being commanded by Mr. Chase was stumbled upon by a British merchant ship named the Indian. And then on the 23rd of February, 93 days after the sinking of the Essex, Captain Pollard's boat was discovered just as serendipitously by a Nantucket whale ship, of all things, named the Dauphin. The 5 total survivors from the 2 boats were reunited on the 17th of March in the harbor at Valparaiso, Chile, aboard USS Constellation, where the 3 men from the chase boat were under the care of the ship's surgeon. On the 23rd of March, 4 of the 5 survivors, with the exception of Captain Pollard, who was not yet in any condition to travel, boarded the whale ship Eagle for the journey back home to Nantucket. And after a further 6 weeks of convalescence, Pollard left for home in May, but not before arranging for the rescue of his other 3 men who were still castaways on Henderson Island. Except here's the trouble. He didn't know they were on Henderson Island. He thought they were on Ducie Island. So the captain of the Australian merchant vessel that was tasked with recovering these guys, he finds not a soul on Ducie Island, and he would have been perfectly within his rights to just go on about his way at that point. But being a conscientious man, he correctly deduced that, maybe they're on Henderson and they just thought they were on Ducie. So he takes another day, goes and checks Henderson, and he finds all 3 men safe and sound. The final tally? 9 men survived, including the captain and the first mate. 2 men died and weren't eaten. 3 men were presumed dead. 6 men died and were eaten. 1 man was shot and eaten. And the survivors, nearly all of them, went back out to sea in whale ships. Like I say, these men were a hardy breed. Hardy in a way that doesn't exist any longer, And I would go so far as to submit that when we lost that hardiness, we lost something of the best part of ourselves as a species. The one thing that leaves me scratching my head at the end of this story is how starkly different our attitudes are toward cannibalism based on whether it happens on land or at sea. None of the survivors of the Essex ever faced any reproach for having engaged in it, but when you move the survival situation out of the sea and onto land, look what happened to the survivors of the Donner Party. They were the objects of revulsion, excluded from polite society for the rest of their lives once that news got around, and similarly, when Francis McClintock returned from the search for the lost Franklin expedition, having turned up some powerful, some might say irrefutable evidence that those men had also been driven to the last resort of survival before ultimately succumbing, it caused a national scandal in England. Everyone simply refused to believe it. It was such a stain on the moral character of these national heroes that the possibility simply had to be dismissed out of hand and not even considered. And Mr. McClintock, who was guilty of nothing but carrying out the assignment he was given to the best of his ability and accurately reporting what he had found, had his reputation ruined. He was, to use the fashionable parlance of the present day, cancelled. Do I have any explanation for why that difference of perception exists between cannibalism on land and cannibalism at sea, and it's so very powerful? I do not. But if you do, I would be fascinated to hear it. Do I wish I had something more uplifting with which to sign off? Yeah, I kind of do, but it is what it is. Sometimes stories about a ship getting smashed to shit by an angry whale and the survivors consuming one another's corpses don't have happy endings. I don't make the news, ladies and gentlemen. I just report it. But having said that, thanks very much indeed for your kind attention. I sure do appreciate it. Do feel free to drop a few coins in the hat if you are so inclined. Links in description. Have a great day and a pleasant tomorrow. See you next time. Get off my lawn.